This is HOA Karen gets denied. They wanted control. I am standing in my own driveway in Salt Lake City, Utah, watching a tow truck back up toward my car, and Carol Howard is waving her arms like she is guiding a 747 onto a runway. Carol yells, "The vehicle is in violation. Hook it now." I moved to the Preserve at Oak Grove 6 months ago because the job at the auto shop paid better than anything back home, and I needed a stable place to finish my employer probation period. One more late arrival, and I am done. The neighborhood looked quiet, the HOA fees were reasonable, and the rules seemed normal. Then I met Carol Howard, social committee chair, spreader of rumors, and the woman who decided my life was her personal enforcement project. The trigger was simple. My buddy Jake stopped by last Tuesday to drop off a toolbox he borrowed. He parked in an unmarked guest spot near my unit for 10 minutes. I walked him out, we talked for maybe 3 minutes, and he left. 20 minutes later, Carol knocked on my door holding a citation slip on a clipboard with no readable text and told me the vehicle was unauthorized and I owed a $50 fine for improper guest registration. I said, "He was here for 10 minutes, the spot is not marked, and I did not see any rule about registration." Carol put on her thin reading glasses she puts on for dramatic effect and said, "I do not need proof, I have paperwork and vibes." I laughed because I thought she was joking. She was not joking. She said, "You have 72 hours to pay or we escalate." I asked what escalate meant and she smiled and walked away. That was the first red-stamped final notice envelope that arrived after every confrontation. It showed up in my mailbox the next morning. Inside was a demand letter for $50, a photocopy of a guest parking policy I had never seen, and a note in handwriting that was obviously Carol's voice, stating that repeat offenders would face towing and vehicle impoundment. I called the HOA management company and got voicemail. I sent an email and got an auto reply. I asked my neighbor, a guy named Ben who sits near the front at meetings and records everything, and he told me Carol had been running a side hustle with the tow vendor for 2 years. He said, "She calls them for anything, they split the fees, and the board looks the other way because she throws the best holiday parties." I paid the $50 because I could not risk my probation period at work. My boss was already watching my attendance after I got stuck in traffic twice last month. One more late arrival ends my probation and I lose the job. I am in the middle of a big contract and distractions could cost me real money. But paying did not stop Carol. It made her worse. A week later, I got a notice taped to my windshield at 6 in the morning. It said my parking decal was expired and I had 24 hours to get a new one or face towing. I checked the decal. It was valid through December. I took a photo of the decal and the notice and walked over to the HOA office, which is a glorified storage room behind the clubhouse. Carol was inside, sitting at a folding table with a laptop and a stack of citation slips on a clipboard with no readable text. I said, "My decal is valid. This notice is wrong." She did not look up. She said, "Decals must be visible from 30 feet in direct sunlight. Yours is faded." I said, "It is not faded, it is fine. Here is a photo." She said, "I do not need your explanation. I need your payment." I said, "Payment for what?" She said, "Replacement decal fee, $25 due today." I walked out and called Ben. He told me to start keeping certified mail receipts and a clean paper trail of notices and responses, because Carol was building a case to hit me with a lien. He said she did it to 3 other people last year. They all paid thousands to settle, and one guy had to sell his condo. I started documenting everything. I photographed every notice, every envelope, every interaction. I kept copies in a binder and uploaded scans to cloud storage. I sent formal written responses to the management company for every single fine and cited the exact HOA covenants that proved Carol was wrong. The management company never replied. 2 weeks later, my girlfriend came to visit. She parked in a marked guest spot directly in front of the guest parking sign, which had no readable text but was clearly labeled with a giant P and a stick figure. She was inside my condo for 40 minutes. When she came out, there was a bright orange boot clamp locked on her front wheel and a sticker on the driver window that said the vehicle was in violation and she had to call a number to arrange release and payment. The release fee was $200. I called the number. A guy with a bored voice said the fee was non-negotiable, and if I did not pay within 4 hours, the fee would go up to $350. I said, "She is parked legally in a marked guest spot. Why is she booted?" He said, "HOA authorized the boot. Take it up with them." I called Carol. She did not answer. I went to her condo and knocked. She opened the door halfway and said, "Your guest did not register in advance. That is a towable offense. The boot is a courtesy." I said, "There is no advance registration rule. I checked the covenants." She said, "The rules are updated quarterly and distributed at board meetings. If you do not attend, that is your problem." I said, "I was never notified of a meeting." She said, "Meetings are posted on the website and the clubhouse bulletin board. Ignorance is not an excuse." I paid the $200 because my girlfriend had to get to work and I could not let her car sit there overnight. When the tow vendor guy came to unlock the boot, I asked him how many boots he does per month in this neighborhood. He said, "About 15, all from the same lady. She has my number on speed dial." I went to the next HOA board meeting. It was held on a Thursday night in the clubhouse. Carol was sitting at the front table with 3 other board members, all of them looking at their phones. There were maybe 8 residents in the audience. Ben was in the front row with a small handheld recorder on his lap. I waited for public comment. When my turn came, I stood up and said I wanted to address the guest parking enforcement policy and the boot fees, and I had documentation proving the fees were being applied inconsistently. Carol interrupted me. She said, "This is not the forum for individual complaints. You need to submit a written request for a hearing." I said, "I have submitted 3 written requests in the last month and received no response." She said, "Then your requests were incomplete." I said, "I have the certified mail receipts right here." She said, "We are moving on. Next item." One of the other board members, a guy in a polo shirt, said, "Actually, I think we should let him speak. This is public comment." Carol shot him a look and said, "Fine, 2 minutes." I laid out the whole thing. The $50 guest fine with no posted rule. The decal replacement scam. The boot on a legally parked car. The lack of meeting notices. The refusal to respond to my written complaints. I said, "I have photos, receipts, and timestamps for all of it, and I am asking the board to review Carol's enforcement actions and refund the fees." Carol said, "Noted. We will take it under advisement. Next item." Ben spoke next. He said, "I have been recording these meetings for a year, and I have documentation of at least 12 instances where Carol has enforced rules that do not exist in the covenants. I am requesting an independent audit of all fines, fees, and towing authorizations issued in the last 2 years." Carol said, "That is a baseless accusation, and I resent the implication." Ben said, "Then you should welcome an audit to clear your name." The polo shirt guy said, "I think an audit is a reasonable request." Carol stood up and said, "I do not need to sit here and be attacked. I volunteer my time for this community, and this is the thanks I get." The third board member, a woman in a blazer, said, "Carol, sit down. We are going to vote on the audit request." Carol sat down and crossed her arms. The vote was 3-1 in favor of the audit. Carol voted no. I walked out of that meeting thinking I had won. I was wrong. The next morning, there was another red-stamped final notice envelope in my mailbox. This one said I owed $300 in accumulated late fees for failure to comply with prior notices, plus a $50 administrative fee for submitting frivolous complaints. I called the management company again. This time, someone actually answered. A woman with a tired voice said the fees were valid under the escalation policy, and if I did not pay within 10 days, the account would be referred to collections, and a lien would be filed. I said, "What escalation policy? I have never seen it." She said, "It is in the supplemental rules addendum distributed in January." I said, "I moved here in June. I never got it." She said, "All residents are assumed to have received it. Call the board if you have questions." I hung up and called a lawyer. The consultation was free. The lawyer said, HOAs can do almost whatever they want as long as they follow their own rules and state law. If they are violating open meeting rules or misapplying fees, you can fight it, but it will cost you more than the fees unless you can prove a pattern of abuse. I said, "I have a pattern. I have documentation." He said, "Good. Keep documenting, get more residents involved, and request a formal hearing. If they deny the hearing, you can file a complaint with the state, but that takes months." If you are enjoying this HOA nightmare, hit the like button and subscribe for more stories where Karens get what they deserve. I requested a formal hearing in writing, sent it certified mail, and waited. The response came 8 days later. The hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks out, same clubhouse, 6 in the evening, and I was allowed 10 minutes to present my case. In the meantime, Carol escalated. I came home from work one afternoon, and there was a tow truck idling in my driveway. Carol was standing beside it, waving her arms and pointing at my car like she was directing an air traffic controller. A teen on a bike braking hard to watch the argument stopped at the curb and pulled out his phone to record. I said, "What are you doing?" Carol said, "Your vehicle is parked in violation of the fire lane clearance rule. It is being towed." I said, "I am parked in my assigned spot, in my driveway. This is not a fire lane." She said, "The painted curb extends into the driveway approach. That makes it a fire lane, and fire lane violations are TOW on site." I looked at the curb. There was no paint. I said, "There is no painted curb." She said, "It was painted last month. You are required to maintain awareness of all property markings." The tow truck driver, a guy in a stained hoodie, said, "Lady, I need authorization in writing or I am leaving." Carol pulled a folded paper from her pocket and handed it to him. He looked at it, shrugged, and started lowering the wheel lift. I said, "I am calling the police." Carol said, "Go ahead. They will tell you the same thing I am telling you. Fire lane violations are non-negotiable." I called 911. The dispatcher said an officer would be there in 15 minutes. I told the tow driver to stop. He said, "I take my orders from the lady who called me, not from you." I stepped in front of the truck. I said, "You are not towing my car without a police officer confirming this is legal." Carol said, "You are interfering with official HOA business. That is another violation." The tow driver said, "I am not getting paid enough for this," and he stopped lowering the lift. The police arrived 12 minutes later. A young officer with a buzz cut and a bored expression got out of the cruiser and asked what was going on. Carol immediately launched into a speech about fire lane enforcement, HOA authority, and my pattern of violations. She handed him the folded paper, which I could now see was a tow authorization form with Carol's signature at the bottom and no readable text. The officer looked at the curb. He said, "I do not see any painted fire lane here." Carol said, "It was painted last month." The officer said, "Ma'am, fire lanes have to be marked in red or yellow, and they have to be visible. If there is no paint, there is no fire lane." Carol said, "The paint must have worn off, but the rule still applies." The officer said, "That is not how it works. If you want to enforce a fire lane, you need to repaint it and post signs. Until then, this is just a driveway." Carol's face went red. She said, "Are you telling me the HOA does not have the authority to enforce its own property rules?" The officer said, "You have authority over HOA rules, but you do not have authority over fire codes or public safety. If you are claiming a fire lane, it has to meet city standards. This does not." The tow driver got back in his truck and said, "I am out. Call me when you have real paperwork," and he drove off. I handed the officer a clean packet and asked for an incident number. The packet had copies of all the notices, the certified mail receipts, the photos of the legal guest parking, and a timeline of Carol's escalation. I said, I want this on record because I have a hearing with the HOA in 2 weeks, and I need proof that this tow attempt was baseless. The officer took the packet, flipped through it, and said, I will write this up as a civil dispute. No citations issued. But you should talk to a lawyer because this looks like harassment. Carol tried to interrupt and said, Officer, I am the social committee chair and I have been tasked with enforcing compliance. This resident has repeatedly. The officer cut her off and said, Ma'am, the HOA is not law enforcement. You can fine people, you can have hearings, but you cannot tow a car from someone's private driveway without a valid legal reason. If you do it again, I will file a report for attempted theft of property. Carol tried to call the police again to add pressure, then backpedaled when the officer asked her for the written rule. She said, never mind, I will handle this through the proper channels, and she walked back to her condo. The officer left. The teen on the bike rode away. I stood in my driveway holding the incident report and realized I was shaking. Ben came over an hour later. He said, I heard what happened. Half the neighborhood is talking about it. Carol is losing it. She knows the audit is coming and she is trying to hit you hard enough that you move out before the hearing. I said, I am not moving. He said, good, because I have something you need to see. Ben pulled out a manila folder. Inside was a complaint log entry that was obviously written in Carol's voice, dated 2 weeks before I moved in. It described a prior resident in my unit as a habitual violator, a problem tenant, and a threat to property values, and it recommended immediate escalation to collections and lien filing. The handwriting matched the notes on all my red-stamped final notice envelopes. I said, she was targeting my unit before I even lived here. Ben said, she does it to everyone who moves into that building. I do not know why. Maybe she does not like the landlord, maybe she just likes the power. But she has been running this scam for 2 years, and the board has ignored every complaint. I said, how do we stop her? Ben said, the audit. If we can prove she has been misapplying fees and working with the tow vendor, the management company will have to act. But we need more residents to come forward. I spent the next week talking to neighbors. I found 4 other people who had been hit with bogus fines, boot fees, and tow threats. One guy had paid $800 over 6 months. A woman in the building next to mine had been fined for a contractor vehicle that was parked legally in a marked service spot while her air conditioning was being repaired. Another resident had been threatened with a lien after Carol claimed his guest had parked in a fire lane that did not exist. Every single one of them had a red-stamped final notice envelope. Every single one of them had a complaint log entry written in Carol's handwriting. Every single one of them had been told the rules were updated quarterly and they were responsible for knowing them, even though no one had ever seen the updates. I put it all together in a binder. I made copies for every board member. I sent a copy to the management company with a cover letter citing the open meeting statute and demanding an explanation for why my written complaints had been ignored. The management company finally responded. A guy named Derek, the community manager, called me and said, I reviewed your complaint and I agree that some of the enforcement actions appear inconsistent. I am scheduling a special board meeting for next Tuesday to review the audit findings and address your concerns. I said, what audit findings? The audit has not happened yet. He said, we conducted an internal review based on your complaints and the request from the last meeting. The findings are not great. I said, what does that mean? He said, it means Carol has been operating outside her authority, and we need to fix it before it becomes a legal problem. The special board meeting was held on Tuesday night. The clubhouse was packed. At least 20 residents showed up, including all 4 people I had talked to, plus a bunch of others who had heard about the drama and wanted to see what would happen. Ben was in the front row with his recorder. Carol was at the front table looking like she had not slept in days. Derek stood up and said, we are here tonight to discuss the findings of the internal audit and to address complaints regarding parking enforcement. I want to start by saying that the board takes these concerns seriously, and we are committed to fair and transparent governance. He pulled out a printed report and started reading. The report showed that Carol had issued 83 parking citations in the last 18 months. 61 of them were for violations that were not listed in the HOA covenants. 32 of them resulted in boot or tow fees. The tow vendor had been paid over $19,000 in that period, and there was no record of competitive bidding or board approval for the vendor contract. The room went silent. Derek said, "Based on these findings, the board is recommending that all parking citations issued by Carol Howard in the last 18 months be reviewed individually, and any fees that were improperly assessed be refunded." Carol stood up and said, "This is absurd. I was enforcing the rules as I understood them, and if there were inconsistencies, that is the fault of the management company for not providing clear guidance." Ben stood up and said, "Carol, you wrote half of those citations for violations you made up. You have been lying to residents, threatening them, and taking money that they do not owe. That is not a guidance problem. That is fraud." Carol said, "I do not need to sit here and listen to this." Derek said, "Carol, sit down. We are not done." Carol sat down. Her face was bright red, and her hands were shaking. Derek continued. He said, "The audit also revealed that the gate access system was configured to lock out specific residents during certain hours, and that configuration was entered by Carol Howard using her board credentials. The lockouts corresponded to dates when residents had complained about parking enforcement. This suggests that amenities lockouts were being used as punishment and leverage." I felt my chest tighten. I said, "I could not get into the pool or the gym for 3 weeks in August. I thought it was a system glitch." Derek said, "It was not a glitch. It was intentional configuration, not a system malfunction. We have the service logs from the gate vendor proving it." I looked at Carol. She was staring at the table and refusing to make eye contact with anyone. I waited for the right audience, because the reveal needed witnesses. I stood up and said, "I have one more thing to add. Carol told me 2 months ago that she does not need proof, she has paperwork and vibes. She said that to my face when I asked her to show me the guest parking rule. And now we have proof that she was making up violations, locking people out of amenities, and working with a tow vendor to generate fees. So I have a question for the board. How much of that $19,000 in tow fees went into Carol's pocket?" Derek said, "We do not have evidence of direct financial benefit to Carol at this time, but we are reviewing the vendor contract and all related invoices. If there is evidence of kickbacks or improper payments, we will refer it to law enforcement." Carol stood up and said, "I am not going to sit here and be accused of crimes. I am leaving." One of the other board members, the woman in the blazer, said, "Carol, if you leave, we are going to vote on your removal. Do you want to stay and defend yourself, or do you want to make this easy?" Carol tried to storm out, and someone in the audience, a guy in a Broncos jersey, asked for her motion on record. She stopped at the door and turned around. She said, "Fine, I motion to table this discussion until we can get legal advice." The blazer woman said, "Motion fails for lack of a second. Now sit down or leave, but we are voting tonight." Carol left. The door slammed behind her. The board voted 4-0 to remove Carol from the social committee chair position and to suspend her voting privileges pending the outcome of the vendor contract review. They also voted to issue a formal apology to all residents who had been improperly cited and to refund all fees that were found to be invalid. Derek said, "We will be mailing refund checks within 30 days. If you believe you were improperly charged, please submit your documentation to the management office and we will review it." I sat down and felt like I could breathe for the first time in months. After the meeting, Ben came over and said, "You did it. You actually did it." I said, "We did it. I could not have done this without you." He said, "Now we just have to make sure they follow through." The refund check arrived 3 weeks later, $275. It covered the boot fee, the decal replacement scam, and the first guest parking fine. The cover letter said the HOA regretted any inconvenience and was committed to fair enforcement going forward. I framed the letter and hung it in my kitchen. But the story was not over. 2 months later, Derek called me again. He said, "I wanted to give you a heads up before this goes public. We finished the vendor contract review and we found something big." I said, "What did you find?" He said, Carol had a side agreement with the tow vendor. For every tow or boot she authorized, she got a 20% referral fee. The vendor kept records because he thought it was a normal business arrangement. We reported it to the Utah Division of Consumer Protection, and they opened an investigation. I said, "How much did she make?" He said, "Close to $4,000 over 2 years. And the vendor contract was never approved by the board. Carol signed it herself using the president's electronic signature without authorization." I said, "That is fraud." He said, "That is what the state is calling it." We also found that Carol had been backdating violation notices to make it look like residents had more warning than they actually got. The whole thing is a mess. We are hiring an outside auditor to go through every fee and fine issued in the last 3 years, and we are going to refund everything that does not hold up. The independent audit took 4 months. The final report was 32 pages long. It found improper late fees tied to notices, backdated violations, unapproved vendor contracts, and a pattern of selective enforcement that violated the HOA's own bylaws. The total refund amount across the neighborhood was $47,000. Carol resigned from the board entirely and moved out of the neighborhood a month later. The board issued a formal statement saying that all enforcement policies were being rewritten and that no single committee chair would have unilateral authority to issue fines or authorize towing. The tow vendor lost the contract, and the HOA switched to a new company that required board approval for every single tow. I got a second refund check for another $120, covering fees I did not even know I had been charged. Ben framed his copy of the audit report and hung it in his living room. The neighborhood group chat blew up with celebration messages and memes about Carol. Someone made a fake movie trailer about the HOA wars and posted it on YouTube. It got 2,000 views. I kept working at the auto shop. I finished my probation period with perfect attendance. My boss gave me a raise and put me on the lead team for the big contract. I bought a nicer car and parked it in my assigned spot every single day, and no one ever put a boot on it again. The final showdown happened 6 months after the audit. The state investigation wrapped up, and Carol was fined $12,000 for fraudulent business practices in order to repay all referral fees. The tow vendor was fined separately and lost his business license. The HOA settled with 3 residents who had filed small claim suits, and the board adopted a new policy requiring quarterly public reviews of all fines and enforcement actions. I ran into Carol one more time at a gas station near the freeway. She was pumping gas into a rental car and she did not see me at first. When she finally looked up, she froze. I did not say anything. I just nodded and walked back to my car. She got in her rental and drove away, and I never saw her again. The neighborhood is quieter now. The new board actually reads the covenants before issuing fines. The management company responds to emails within 48 hours. The guest parking spots are clearly marked, and there is no advance registration requirement. The painted fire lane curb where Carol claimed authority she did not have was repainted and properly marked, and it does not extend into anyone's driveway. I still see Ben at meetings. He still records everything. He says it is good insurance. I still keep my binder of documentation in my closet, just in case. And I still get a little nervous every time I see a tow truck, but it passes quickly, because I know the rules now, and I know how to fight back when someone tries to make up new ones. Thanks for watching, and I will catch you in the next one.